So this guy that we're looking at is a plate from the Loomis book, and this is pretty much the set of proportions that we're going to be using throughout this course. It'll be Loomis and Parad, but they more or less agree on what the proportions of a human figure are. You'll find that from book to book, from artist to artist, some of them have slightly different opinions. Sometimes the figure varies from book to book, and that's what you would expect because it's impossible to have a perfect set of human proportions or a completely average set of human proportions. That data doesn't exist, and it would vary from continent to continent anyway. So this guy is 7.5 heads high. This is what we're going to be using as our base, and we'll be using the head as a unit of measurement, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, it's a fairly common thing to do. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But the first thing I want to mention before we get started is just talking about the pose that this guy's in, because this is also the pose that we'll be doing our sculpts in. This is called the anatomical pose, and it's typically what you'll see in most anatomy books, and most écorchés that aren't, advanced pose écorchés will be in this pose, and it's just the most relaxed pose for a human figure to be in, whilst being completely clear. So, the hands are pointed outwards rather than pointed inwards, so we get a clear view at the front and back. And also, it means that in this pose, the bones of the radius and the ulna, this is the ulna, this is the radius, they're not rotated over each other. When the arm pronates, when that arm folds around, the radius wraps over the ulna, twists over the ulna, and so the bones then become twisted. So this is a relaxed pose with the radius and the ulna not twisted, and maximum clarity. That doesn't necessarily make it the ideal pose for production. There's a lot of talk about what is the best pose for, with the best T pose, or the best bind pose, rig pose, the best pose to hand off to a rigger. And the answer is whatever the rigger wants. It's going to vary from rigger to rigger. It's going to vary depending on the creature supervisor, depending on the creature. And this is one of those things where there's an awful lot of talk about it, but really you're just there to service whatever they want. Oftentimes the arm, it'll be this sort of pose, but with the arm raised up to maybe 45 degrees or something. And that's good from a modeling point of view, because it means you don't have this tightness in here, so it's going to be easier to sculpt that. Traditionally, we've seen the arms come straight out the sides here. The problem that you get then is that the deltoid and the trapezius would start to bunch up in this sort of position. So you're starting from a position of tension. And you'll have tension in a specific area in the shoulders, but everywhere else will be relaxed. So that's why oftentimes people would stay clear of that. And also after a certain point, the clavicle and the scapula will start to rotate as well. So they will already be in a kind of offset position. So I don't think I've ever, I have. For games work, I have done this, but in VFX, I've never been asked to do that. Oftentimes, I'm asked to bend the legs, so they start with a bend in to start with. So from the side view, it would be something like that. When you're doing that, you just need to be careful, because the whole figure is going to drop. So your 7.5 heads high suddenly becomes slightly lower. And sometimes I've asked to have, or people have asked me to bend the arms upwards 90 degrees as well, and even bend that over and have the palms facing down this way, or maybe it was up. No, I think it was down. It doesn't matter. Like I say, that's going to be dependent on the rigger, and they'll have their reasons for asking you. Now, before we go into the specifics of the proportions that we're going to be looking at this week, I want to talk a little bit about using the head as a unit of truth, which I've mentioned before, but I think it's worth sort of clarifying. Now, the idea of truth in sculpture, especially when we're using reference, especially if we're trying to make something look like something else, becomes a very, very important idea, because when we're when we're sculpting in a way that we're not tracing, you can take reference and you can line your stuff up over the top of it and sort of trace it so it's exact, and that's certainly not what we're going to be doing in this course, and actually something that I very rarely do in production. But what it means is when you don't have that, then you sort of, it's very difficult to have a point of truth that you can rely on, a point where you can say, this is exactly right, and use that to correct everything else. And what we're going to be doing in this course is creating that point, because you can always have one point. You can always, any point on your sculpture, it doesn't matter how messed up your sculpture is, there is always one point that you can say, that is completely accurate, and everything else might be wrong. So what we'll be doing is we'll be blocking in something for the head this week. And, it doesn't matter if your head is this big or this big, that is going to be your unit of measurement, and the rest of the body will fit around that. And as we progress through the weeks, you're going to find that what you did in this initial week, even though you thought all the proportions were fine, as you've then developed it, because what you'll be doing in the homework is really just, this will just be a cylinder, and this might be 2 cylinders, and what you'll find is that maybe you made mistakes here and you need to go back and fix those. And I certainly did it in the demonstrations I've done for this course. I make, I don't know, a bunch of mistakes. I don't know how many, quite a few, but those mistakes become apparent as you start to explore the shapes a little bit more and refine it, and to see to start to see what fits, and if something doesn't fit or it doesn't line up with the proportions that we're using, then you can go back and tweak that. But you can't go back and tweak the head, because any change you make to that, you're distorting your point of truth, and then suddenly you don't have that truth anymore. And actually, I would say we have 2 points of truth, really, because we have the head, and the size of the head is 1 point, but we also know the full figure is going to be 7.5 heads high. So we'll have our head, and then, so this is going to be something that we rely on as truth, but we can also then take that down 7.5 times, and that's going to give us another point of truth, which is the height of the sculpture. And that can't change unless you've somehow measured incorrectly your 7.5 heads. That can't change because the size of the head can't change. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, hopefully it will become more apparent as we go forward with the sculpting. So let's start getting specific, and I'm going to jump over to Victor Perard for this. Both Richard and Perard, like I've mentioned, they tend to agree on proportions. What I like about Perard is he spends a bit of time and effort just looking at head measurements. And like I mentioned, this is going to be the major thing for us. So he goes through all of the bones and measures those with regard to the head height, or the skull height at least. So as you can see, this is 7.5 heads high. Halfway is the greater trochanter. We'll come to that at another time, but this is in total agreement with Richet. So let's take a look at the bones, and we'll start with obviously the skull is 1 head high, so this is your truth, and from there let's look at the large bony masses. The pelvis is a good way to start because that's 1 head high. So right off the bat, we've got something that matches, that fits right into our unit of truth, our head size. It's 1.25 heads wide as well. This Perard doesn't show that, but on a male at least. A female, the pelvis will be slightly lower and slightly wider due to childbirth. This hole here needs to be as big as possible to fit a baby through it. He doesn't mention the depth of the pelvis, sort of the length front to back. That's slightly less. It's let's say 2/3 of a head, so around that. The rib cage we'd normally say is 1.5 heads high. I think this diagram needs some clarification because there's different points here. basically the one half heads high comes from the top of the manubrium, the top of the sternum, this point here. This is the pit of the neck, to the bottom of the 10th rib, which is here. Actually, I see that Parad has that slightly lower, which would coincide with the bottom of the 12th rib, the floating ribs. Richer makes it to the bottom of the 10th rib. Stick it where you want. It's going to make maybe an inch worth of difference. And I actually counted these ribs as well, and Parad has 11 here, which is slightly confusing. There should be 10 ribs that are connected to the costal cartilage and 2 floating ribs. But I digress. 1.5 heads high from the top of the sternum, from the pit of the neck to the bottom of the 10th rib, I would say. The floating ribs we don't usually take into account in our measurement because they tend to get pushed in and aren't so much of a bony landmark. Whereas so this is sort of the artistic bottom of the rib cage, if you will, even though there are floating ribs after this. Yeah, and what we're seeing up here is because the rib cage has an angle up to the back. So the first rib, which is this, is angling up to the back or down to the front. So bear that in mind when you're roughing this in later. It's not the same at the front and the back, and it's the front that you want to pay attention to. Again, Parad doesn't describe the depth of the rib cage. I don't think I've seen a book that does. It's a strange thing that these things get missed. I would say about 3/4 of a head in terms of depth. So on a human, the rib cage is squashed sort of front to back. On an animal, it tends to get squashed from side to side. So we've got the head is 1 head high, pelvis 1.5. Pelvis 1 head high as well, 1/4 heads wide on a male. Rib cage 1/2 heads high, 1/4 heads wide as well, and 3/4 from front to back, and 2/3 from front to back on the pelvis. Those are my estimations. So we'll join those all up with the spine, which is a nice cleanish 3 heads. It's 3 plus a bit. The bottom of the sacrum has a bit extra, and this bit is the atlas. This is the bit that plugs right into the base of the skull. So from top to bottom, that gives us 3 and a bit heads. I'll go into the long bones now, and we'll start by taking a look at the femur, because the femur is 2 heads high. So that's a nice clean measurement, and that's the biggest, the longest bone in the body. So 2 heads high for the femur, and as we can see here, the humerus, which is the upper arm bone, is 1.5 heads high. So that gets us this. Radius is the smallest of the bones of the limbs, and that's 1 head high. So we've got femur at 2, humerus 1.5, and radius at 1. Now, in between there, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to eyeball it a little bit. It depends on your it'll vary from person to person. Some people will want to be very scientific and be like, I need to know that it's 1 3/6 heads high or whatever, and that's fine. You could probably take measurements yourself and memorize those from here. The way that I remember it is the radius and the ulnar are pretty much the same size. There's this little hook here that will come to when we look at the arm. That's what grabs onto the bottom of the humerus. So that little hook, and that's the spike of the elbow, really. That's slightly going over the elbow joint, so that gives us a tiny bit more. So for me, the ulnar is 1 head high plus a little bit. It's not scientific, but that's how I look at it. Tibia and fibula are the same size, and they're slightly more than the humerus. A bit under the femur, and then this is the patella, the kneecap. That's we're not really taking into account with these proportions. So 2 heads high for the femur, 1 head high for the radius, 1/2 for the humerus, ulnar tiny bit, a little bit more than the radius, tibia and fibula a little bit more than the humerus. So we'll finish up on the on what's left. So that, I mean that's given us pretty much the main mass of the body. The foot comes in a little over a head in terms of length. I think, if memory serves me, I make that about a third of a head wide. I think you'll have to wait for the week on the foot for me to confirm that. The hand about 2/3, I'd say, and this is with the carpal bones as well. So this is including the wrist. The scapula fits twice into the rib cage. So, so here, yeah, we can say that the scapula is a little bit under a head high, but we can be slightly more exact about that, because if we're saying our rib cage is 1.5 heads high, then we can say the scapula is 3/4 of a head high, and that's going to give us 2 scapulas fitting into the rib cage. And the clavicle, like the hand, 2/3 of a head. And yeah, that's all we're going to use to block in the proportions of the human body. As and when it's necessary, we'll be more specific about proportions. When we look at the hand, we'll find ways to find the length of the individual phalanges, the individual bones of the digits and things like that. And there's, you could analyze these to the nth degree. You could find out, you could take the pelvis and go, right, what's the height of the pelvis? Now what lines up with halfway across the pelvis? And find ways, find little patterns, find all of these things for yourself, because this is all the guys in the anatomy books have been doing. They've just been either referencing it from other places, like I'm doing here, stealing directly from Perard, or they figured it out for themselves, like I've done when telling you the depth of the rib cage and pelvis. And so it's, like I say, this is going to depend on your own personality. Some people will really enjoy breaking this down and finding patterns and finding measurements. And if that's something that that you enjoy, then by all means do it. And the more that you can memorize this stuff, the faster you're going to be sculpting it, and also the more checks you're going to give yourself to double check whether you've made any mistakes or not. Because the way I approach sculpture is I tend to sculpt quite loose. I make an awful lot of mistakes, so it really helps me to have these checks that I can go in and just go in and fix all of the mistakes I've made, which are normally fairly numerous. You might remember that I mentioned in the first week that the thing that we're looking for of the most important is the biggest shapes, right? And the biggest shapes are the proportions. So really, in the last 10 minutes, this might be the most important thing that we'll be doing on the course. It's not. That's a slight contrivance. The most important thing is the nature of the course, the themes of the course, the understanding shape and basic body mechanics, and the nature of what anatomy is. Those are the important things. Memorizing proportions is great as well. Let's go back to Richer's proportions. So here we go. Just undo all of this. So now that we've... Can't undo that. Bear with. Better. Okay. So now that we've looked at all the bones individually, I want to go over just a couple of ways to place them, because that's what we're going to be doing this week, right? You make all the bones, and then we place them. And it's not a particularly difficult exercise, but if you can memorize this, then this will be your go-to figure from now until you come up with your own, or from now on forever if you stick with a 7.5 heads high as your basic figure. So we've got the head. Let's go down 3 heads. And 3 heads, so 1 head, there's a second, and there's a third. So so this is 1, 2, 3, and that takes us to the top of the hips. So this here, you can see, this is the impact on the surface. The top of the hips is roughly 3 heads down. And we know the height of the hips on a male is 1 head high. So we then just drop down another head from there, and that's going to give us the bottom of the hips. So straight away, we can place the hips right from the get-go, as long as we have our head and that's 7.5 heads high off the ground. We can plonk our hips in there, and then we can go to the ground to put the legs in. So if we go 7.5 heads down, we go here and count our way back up in terms of heads. We just need to go up 2 heads. So there's one. You can see Richer's marked it in there. There's 1 head. 2 heads gets us to the knee joint. So 2 heads gets us to the knee joint. That lets us place our femur, and it lets us place the tibia and the fibula. And with those in place, you just kind of stick the feet at the end of the tibia and fibula, and so that that gets us the lower half of the body blocked in. The halfway point of the body is 3 1/4 heads. Sorry, 3 3/4 heads high. That takes us to here. So this is the halfway point of the body. Important to remember, and important to remember what it lines up with. It lines up with a bony landmark on the hips called the symphysis pubis. That's here. Maybe in Perard's drawings. Yeah, it's this point. We'll look at it more when we look at the hips, but that's the halfway point of the body. It's not that pronounced typically on the human figure, but on the live model. But this is around where the pubic hair would start. So that's generally a strong enough visual guide. And then this is an important bony landmark. This is the greater trochanter of the femur, and that lines up at the halfway point of the body as well. So sometimes people will take the belly button to be the halfway point, and that's a mistake. It's just that's quite visually impactful, so people sort of translate it that way. But that's not going to do you any favors if you stick that at halfway. Now, I've never come up with a super accurate way of placing the rib cage. The thing that I always bear in mind, especially on the male, is that the bottom of the rib cage, the bottom of the 10th rib, is surprisingly close to the hips. Oftentimes, if you buy a cheaply made plastic skeleton, you'll see massive gaps between the top of the hips and the bottom of the skeleton and the bottom of the rib cage. I think this point here, I think that's where Richer. Well, I'm sure that's where Richer is saying that's the bottom of the rib cage, and so this can be as small as two finger width between the top of the hips and the bottom of the rib cage, especially because he's got the hips slightly higher than 3 heads high. So just a couple of finger widths apart, 2, 3 maybe. There you can place the bottom of the rib cage. And for what we'll be doing, we'll have already made the rib cage, and we know that's 1.5 heads high, and that's going to get us to the pit of the neck. And in terms of placement of the arms, the bottom of the rib cage lines up fairly closely with the bottom of the humerus. There's a slight difference here on Richer's illustration, but it's roughly in the same area. So that's going to help us place the arms, and also once we place the scapula as well, we know we're going to have to fit the humerus into that socket, and so that gives us 2 checks basically. We make sure the arm lines up at the bottom here, and then we make sure that this all behaves nicely here. The arm fits into the socket of the scapula, and this is the guide for placing the arm. And then as we did with the legs, the rest of the bones can just attach onto there. The thing you want to be wary of course, is that it's in this pose that this epicondyle of the humerus lines up closely with the bottom of the rib cage. If the arms are in a different pose, even slightly offset, the arms are going to be pivoting from here, so the bottom of the humerus is going to move, and that's going to line up with different things. And things like this can throw off your proportions. But these are the rough proportions that I would use to block in the figure. But you can analyze this, and you can find your own things. So looking at it now, I can see that here's the pit of the neck, and that seems to line up fairly closely with the top of the scapula. So you can use that as the basis for putting in your scapula there, and then you know that the scapula is half the height of the rib cage, so you can make sure that fits twice into the rib cage. It's completely up to you how scientific you want to be about this. A lot of the time, my gut reaction is to say, look, if it looks like it works and it fits the brief that you're being given, then it works. the brief might be that it has to be the exact proportions of a certain thing, of a certain actor or something, in which case that's what it needs to do. The brief may be just that it needs to look great, and in that case, as long as it looks great, that's all that matters. So I really think that's all for the big proportions of the figure that I really want to talk about for now. It's probably worth mentioning fleshy landmarks. I use them now and again. There's danger in using fleshy landmarks because they're less reliable than bone. Bone will stay the same length whatever the pose of the figure is, and won't change much over time with age. Obviously, for the first 20 years the bones will be growing, but after that they tend to stay consistently the same length. There's compression in the spine and things as you get older, but these are the proportions I would use for young adults, up until middle-aged men, let's say. And as people get older, the fleshy landmarks, they're going to start to droop and they're going to start to become less reliable. Or even as the figure gets posed, the landmarks could get squished together and change quite significantly. But for the anatomical pose, let's see what lines up. Now the nipples, I make them often to be about a head high. Richer makes them slightly less or slightly higher than 2 heads down. And the belly button to be slightly more than 3 heads down. The lovely thing about this drawing is that it's showing the front and the back at the same time, and it's always great to relate the front of your figure with the back of your figure. So here we can see how closely the belly button and the top of the hips, the highest point of the hips, relate, because the highest point of the hips are angled forwards. We'll look at this in more depth. So the highest point is here at the back, and is very closely aligned with the belly button. And the great thing about working digitally is we can just chop through that mesh without damaging anything, just to see how well these things line up. And relating the front of the figure to the back of the figure is a very important thing in sculpture, and relating from side to side as well. So you're making sure that the front and the back views agree and the side views agree. It's essentially like having 4 drawings that are all lining up exactly, that they all conform to the same idea. So let's drop another head from the top of the hips. That takes us to this, the gluteal fold, which is the crease of the buttocks. And yeah, that's about a head down from the top of the hip. So it's about where the bottom of the hips are. But again, it's going to vary from person to person depending on what the pose is, and this can quite easily sag or be tighter or flabbier or whatever it is. But for what it's worth, that's what 4 heads down. And I think as far as fleshy landmarks go, that's pretty much all I'm using. Again, looking at it now, the bottom of the pecs in this line up very nicely with the bottom of the scapula. So yeah, that'd be a great thing to run off. Again, it's going to vary. Some people are going to have pecs that are slightly higher, slightly lower. You can't rely on any of this stuff. But as far as just throwing stuff up there and making sure things are roughly working, I think that these are going to be a good starting point. Like I say, we will be going over this more as we look at the arm. We're going to look at, the deltoid finishes halfway along the humerus, for example. So we'll constantly be looking at ways of refining or adding to our database of proportions. And also, as we continue with the sculpt, constantly going back and checking, do our proportions still work? And this is something that I'm going to mention time and time again, but the process of sculpture is not a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not just a journey from the start to an end. It's a journey from the start to another place, and then you go back, and then you go forward, and then you go back again, and then eventually you get to the end by going backwards and forwards. At least my approach is. That might be because I make more mistakes than most people. I don't know, but I think it's generally a healthy approach to have. So yeah, this is the figure. We're blocking it in using the head as a unit of truth and as the basis of our measurements. We've looked at the length of the various bones. We've looked at how to slot those together, in a kind of very Lego-y sort of way to get our basic human figure that we can we can take from now and forever and use to throw up some proportions. We've looked at some fleshy landmarks. So I am going to talk briefly about the proportions of the head as well. This course doesn't really touch on the head, but we've got to have one, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So we don't have a week in the anatomy course where we focus on the head and the intricacies of the anatomy of the head. And that's really just because, 10 weeks is a good amount of time for a course, but for anatomy, that really requires a lifetime worth of study, I think if we were to include a head in that 10 weeks as well, it would just, it would be too much to try and take in. The head requires its own sort of period of study. But let's talk about it a bit and go into the basic proportions of it. And this is as far as we'll take it for this course. And in terms of blocking it in, I want to look at the side view, because one of the really nice things about the profile of the head is that we can fit it really nicely, really neatly into a cube. The front of the head is slightly narrow. It doesn't fit into the cube so well, so we'll focus on the side, and that's going to get us 90% of the way there, really. So we take our cube, we divide it into these 4 different cubes by just chopping it in half, vertically and horizontally. We then take our front half and we divide that into thirds, and that gives us this front third, which is what we're going to use to help place this circle. Now this is for drawing the side, but for sculpting it, we would just, instead of having a circle, we'd have a sphere. So we make sure that that circle hits these 3 edges, the front third that we divided this front half into, the top of the cube, and the back of the cube, or square, if we're doing it as a drawing. And that means that circle can only be one size. We couldn't have two different circles that would hit all of these 3 edges. And this is essentially going to give us the shape of the skull there. We're not really going to change that at all. What we're then going to do with this front third is just the section of it that touches the from the where the sphere touches that front third, we'll just drop a line straight down, and that gets us the front plane of the face. We're going to pull it out a bit more as we add in the features and things, but that's our starting plane, and that's our starting point for the front plane of the face. And then from there we can pull the jaw back and up to close to hit the bottom of this circle. So again, if we are aiming for the bottom, that only gives us one angle there, and the back of the jaw is about halfway. So we're going from here, we're aiming for the bottom, and we're stopping at the halfway point, and that's going to give us the same angle each time. Now for the features of the face, this kind of rule of thirds is going to help us. It's going to be a really good go-to thing. So I use this all the time when I'm blocking faces. What I haven't figured out is how to pick up this top line, whether there's a neat mathematical way of doing that. But essentially, this is the top of the hairline. So from where the hairline starts, or from where one would imagine the hairline to start on someone who doesn't have any hair, so this is the hair of the guy. From the top of that hairline to the bottom, we then divide that into thirds. That's what these lines are. And the first third will bring us to the eyebrows, which is also the angle break on the eyebrow ridge here. So that's the first third. The next third down gets us to the bottom of the nose and to the bottom of the ear. And the bottom third gets us to the bottom of the jaw. So like I say, this is something that I use all the time, but I just eyeball where that hairline starts. If you get that slightly out, if you were to place the hairline there, everything else is going to be slightly out as well. But yeah, I don't know, what is that, like a sixth of a cube, of the whole cube? Let's say that. Let's say it's a sixth of the whole cube. If we go back to the halfway measurements that we took right at the start, this is going to allow us to help place our eye and our ear. So the outer corner of the eye sits on the halfway point. There's always a tendency for people to put this too high. but the eye is always, well, often, most of the time, is around half the height of the head. That's the outer corner of the eye. The eyes do angle downwards slightly as they go to the middle, so the inner corner will be slightly lower, and it gets us the start of the ear here. The ear itself angles backwards, so we can sort of take the jaw, and the jaw also has this slight backwards movement, so we can take that and just carry that on up into the ear, and that gets us that sort of angle. Also, to find the base of the skull, we'll just go slightly above that bottom third. So there's the base of the skull itself. And then what we've got here is an angle change. This is as the jaw turns and goes underneath. And then here's the start of the front of the neck, is the back of the neck. And the spine's going to be buried fairly deeply within here, somewhere there. Now what we're going to do is, in the sculpting demonstration, I'm going to take this as a block-in, and then I'm going to show you how to then use these basic measurements to correlate with the front view to get a cohesive whole. But while we're here, I'll mention a couple of things regarding the width, which I'll then reinforce when we talk about it. So the widest point of the head, it's about here. The head flares out if we look at the top view of the head, or of the skull. Something like this, right? It's short. It's less wide at the front than it is across the middle here, and so this point here would be about this point there. So that's going to be the widest point of the head, and the widest point of the face itself, because the face is also has this tapering tendency, is about here. We've got the zygomatic arch, which is the cheekbone. And the widest point is about here. Then it then dives back in towards the ear. So widest point of the face is the widest point of the zygomatic arch, and the widest point of the head is significantly further back here. Which, now that I look at it, maybe that's half. Maybe if we divide that cube, we go halfway, so 3/4 of the way across our cube. If I can, maybe that gets us the widest point of the head, roughly. I don't know, I just made that up then, but if it works, it works. This way of blocking in head from the side view I got from my first anatomy instructor, Andrew Amaral, who doesn't have a book detailing it, but Andrew Loomis does have a book where I can't remember which one it is. He has a bunch of books, but in one of them he has a very similar process that he goes through for blocking in the head. And he starts with a sphere, exactly like we're doing, but because the head isn't spherical from the front, which we'll see in the sculpting demonstration, he then takes takes the side and slices that off, and that gets you the head from the front. But we're going to look at that. This is going to be our basis of blocking in the main proportions, and then we'll look at the rest in the sculpt. So one final thing, we've looked at the proportions of the large bony masses of the body. We've looked at fitting them together, and we've looked at the head, which I've said 1,000 times, that's our unit of truth. So that's nearly everything, but I do want to talk about the gesture of all of these working together. It's a very important thing. Because you could plonk all of these together and have a proportional figure that still doesn't feel human. If you're lacking the large rhythms. I'll use rhythm and gesture sometimes interchangeably, but gesture is essentially large rhythm, which is when we talk about the body in full here in a holistic sort of sense. These are the largest rhythms of the body. So what I'm talking about is this sort of movement, right? The rib cage angles forward, the hips angle back. This leg is coming slightly forward and then straightens off again. Now, we'll talk about all this in more depth as we look at each individual thing, and I'll go over it again in the demonstration. I'm just mentioning it here because it's a very important thing. So from the back view, we have a similar thing. So on the legs, the femur is angling in. So the biggest gesture of the leg, because of that, is an inward angle. If I can draw it, there we go, an inward angle. Now, everyone's temptation when they're starting out is to go, right, and one thing I know about legs is they go straight down, and you end up with legs like this, right? And this is always gives people problems. The natural tendency of the leg is to lean in. When the leg has weight on it, it can lean in even more, or you get something like that, and that can create some really nice rhythms and gestures. And even from the back, you can see there's the tibia and the fibula straighten out, so you get this ankle break, bump. Now the arm has the same break, dunk, dunk. There's the ankle break, and again the tendency would be to go, well, I know an arm is straight, but it's not. Like if I'm trying to draw a line along that, you can see it's coming off that and breaking. Now these are just some examples. Like I say, we'll be going over this in depth every week of the course because it's a very important thing, I think. So so when I teach, it's a significant part of what I talk about, and there is reason to it. If we go back to the side view, this sort of thing, this movement, it's a very human curve, and that's because let's take a look at the spine. So the spine's starting here, and it's got a slight curve to it to support the head. Then it's pushed out by the rib cage, and then curves back in more to support the rib cage. Then it gets pushed out again by the hips, and finally, even with the coccyx, the end of the sacrum is curving in more to support that. So it's a functional curve. It's there to give us strength, and we are the masters of walking upright. Some primates give it a go, but they don't have this curve because their primary purpose, their primary function is primary way of moving is not to walk upright, and they would have difficulty if they were to do that all day. Birds will walk on two legs, but in a very bobby sort of way. It's so it makes it a very human curve, and if you didn't have this, people's tendency, exactly same with the legs, is to make this too straight up and down. That's where you're going to lose the feeling of strength and organicness. At the same time, you could say, right, well, the very biggest relationship I can find is something like this, going from the back of the head down the body, and you can see there's a relationship with the bony point of the ankle here. So the largest movement is fairly vertical. That's because we're stood up vertically. They will obviously vary depending on people's posture and the position of the head and things like that. But yes, the biggest gesture of the body is, from the side view, is a straight vertical. But within that, there's all this movement, and that's what we want to find. Rib cage, bang, push forward, hips, bang. How far can you push that? How much can you find it? If you push it too far, it's going to look kind of broken. But if you get it just far enough, it's going to be a very aesthetically appealing thing. So yeah, we'll go over this more. I'm waffling a bit at this point, but there you go. That's the main proportions of the human body and what we're looking for and how we're looking to make it all work together.